Welcome back to the class, everyone. Today we will be talking about how to apply your Zetas once again, or rather, how you shouldn't apply them. Once again, this whole situation slash video is being prompted because the way that things that are currently going in the endgame, almost all the new characters that are coming out are requiring 2 Zetas. And while on the one hand, it's kind of cool that we get to reuse our resources, it means that a lot of the things that I've spent my Zetas on beforehand were just terrible ideas. So that's kind of the whole point of this video, is going through and looking at, specifically for mid-game or even early game players, what Zetas should have never been implied in the first place and really didn't do that much. One thing I do want to touch on before we get into the whole 10 characters or whatever, rather they're Zetas, is this is not about Zetas that you used like a long time ago and are now just not very useful for your roster. Because while, for example, I don't really love the Chirpa Zeta for my roster anymore, this was actually very important for a long time, both for the individual Wicked event as well as for the 3PO event, and then it was even like a GAC and TW team for me years and years ago, back when I got a lot of mileage. So really not trying to talk about Zetas that just aren't good anymore when they were good for a very long time. We're trying to look at the ones that just are probably not necessary ever, or at least I applied them too late in the cadence for them to actually be any good. So going back here, we're going to be starting off with Moff Gideon. So Moff Gideon has 2 Zetas. His leadership Zeta is the one that we're going to be talking about. And gosh, this thing is a pain in the butt. So before we even get over to the fact that it's not all that great, it has one of the strictest requirements of any leadership. Like, it's up there with Starkiller's unique, where he needs to have Imperial Troopers. Up until that point, that's pretty normal. But then, like, he can only have 1 tank. He has to have 2 attackers and or an additional support. And then for 3v3, that kind of, that can be, you can interchange each one there. But yeah, you need to have this exact thing of 1 tank, 2 attackers, and 1 additional support ally. So that within itself isn't great, because it really pigeonholes. You can't just like put all your supports in there, which most of their good troopers are support. But then like the payoff for it also just isn't that good, especially when you start to compare it to Veer's lead, which is also really good, Pitt's lead, which is somewhat situational, and then just all the other Empire leads that are already sitting out there, like Emperor Palpatine and Lord Vader. It just doesn't end up being that good. And in fact, I did it specifically for 3v3, thinking, oh, you know, Veer's can like take Piet and Stark, and Gideon can take Dark and Storm or something like that. I tried it like 3 times and I lost every single time, because it just doesn't have the juice, at least for my roster, to ever go anywhere. So I definitely regret the leadership Zeta. I believe the other one's the unique. This one's actually very good, or it might actually be the special. This was actually pretty good if that's the Zeta. Whatever his other Zeta is, apply that one. Do not apply the leadership Zeta. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at Ezra. And Ezra, while his Zeta within itself isn't really all that great, and by the way, I applied this probably within the last year. This wasn't like something I did to beat the Throne event. This represents something larger, and one concept that I think needs to transcend Ezra himself, and that is, if you ever hear the line, but they have a ship, that's really not that great of a reason to apply a Zeta. The only places that really ever matters is if you have a ship that has a specific speed threshold that they need to cross, like Vader versus Negotiator, by the way. Like, that would be kind of a good example where they need that Zeta. Like, it's just not a super great idea, and Ezra's a perfect example of that. There was a time when it seemed like we were going to have so many more Zetas than we knew what to do with, and then again, like I said, CG started to come out with a lot of characters, and a lot of characters that needed many Zetas, and then putting Zetas on retroactively. So I applied Ezra's, and I just totally regret it. Like, that doesn't really change at all the amount of stats the ship gets. It probably gets like 200 to 300 more health. That's not even a full hit for an enemy ship, so it makes literally no difference. And then the Zeta itself actually isn't terrible. It's okay-ish, but it's on a character that just isn't relevant at all, which we'll be talking about that concept a little bit more. Up next is going to be Dengar. Dengar is actually a pretty good character overall, not that Moff Gideon wasn't, but the thing that I really don't like about his unique Zeta, which, yeah, it's this one right here, where he adds 3% health and protection when this ability's effects trigger, is because of his stealth mechanics, and he's actually really good at surviving even outside of the stealth. He's always the last to die, so there's really no point into trying to make sure that he's living longer by gaining more health protection. because you're never going to target him to begin with. He's actually really hard to kill because he keeps constantly going into stealth, and then his base stats for like protection, health, and defense aren't terrible either. Like, he's actually kind of a hard character to kill. Beyond that, not to mention, if you're probably using a boss lead where he's even harder to kill because you have to get through all the protection and extra defense and stuff like that, and then he also is just a really good healer. So okay character, but just because you have a good character, we need to move away a little bit from this mindset of, oh, he's really good and I use him, so I should just apply everything. That's not really what we should be leaning into if we want to try to get the best bang for our buck. So definitely regret Dengar's as well, as unfortunately. And here we're going to talk a little bit about the relevancy again. Vet Han Zeta, I think, is actually kind of decent. Whenever Han gains any status effect, he gains 50 armor penetration, stacking until the end of his next turn. So this can be really fun because he's a character that counters a lot. So if he keeps gaining all these buffs passively or stuff like that, and he's countering, his counters are going to keep hitting harder and harder. The issue is, the character himself just really isn't that relevant, and you might be using him in kind of a filler squad, but if we're going to be running out of Zetas as we continue to progress our roster, he's not a character you want to overinvest in. Like, you probably have him R3 because of SLKR, which is super great, but at the same time, I wouldn't really encourage anyone to keep on investing in him like I did and bringing up the really high relics and putting the stuff on him. It's just not really the best bang for your buck. Because this, if you look at this ability and start to apply this to a bunch of other random attackers, this would actually be really good on a ton of them. I'm just thinking of specifically Fennec, actually, how much damage she would do with this, or maybe even BT1, although I guess BT1 takes more turns, so it might not be as relevant. But anyways, yeah. Sometimes the Zeta is good, but the character just isn't relevant. This one's a bit of a hot take. So Maul, again, amazing character, super good. But it feels like they just gave him 3 Zetas because he was a conquest character and not because he actually warranted 3 Zetas. So if we look on a special, this is the one that we're going to be referring to, Fervent Rush. And if an enemy was defeated by the stack, Maul gains the maximum stacks of anguish. You can really never plan for this. Every single team that you fight out there is going to have a different mod set or different datacron set than the ones that came before it. So you can't fine-tune Maul's damage or his turn order or whatever so that you can always land this fervent or this AoE to kill someone and for you to get all 5 stacks of anguish back and be able to go on it again. So it really just comes down entirely to luck. And I think I remember a whole one time where I was actually able to do this in a specific fight where it mattered. And I mean, I've had Maul, I think he's been out for 1.5 years now, maybe 2, actually probably closer to 2 years. And I got 1 use out of it. So it's not, again, really not something that I would recommend overall. It doesn't really impact that many battles. And it just kind of makes him unreliable. And I've even seen some people kind of make some mistakes where they'll use it instead of going for another ability, thinking that, oh, it's close enough, and the character that was in the red had too much defense and then didn't die, and then the whole thing just kind of falls apart because they didn't use another move. Dark Trooper is another really good example of a great character where the Zeta just doesn't make a difference at all. So if we look at what it actually does here, not that can't be critically, it's actually on a special. If Dark Trooper has less than 3 stacks of Dark Trooper squad, it gains 1 stack of Dark Trooper squad. So 2 problems with this. Number 1, and this really is kind of neither here nor there, but it bugs me. He starts with 4. He can only get back to 3 with the Zeta. I don't really follow like why that was necessary. I don't know why they couldn't let him get all the way back up to 4. I'm not sure why that would have been the broken part of the Zeta, but at any rate, that just bugs me. What is actually more problematic with this is troopers are commonly known as glass cannons. When you're going there with Veers, Piet, Dark, and whoever else, you are just bulldozing the enemy team, killing them one by one, gaining even more turn meter, even more stacks of Emperor's Trap, and just killing and killing and killing and killing. And you either do that and win like gloriously, or you were never able to get a single kill and they just slaughter you. Like, that's just how they function as a squad. Lack of defensive viability, but a whole lot of offense. Basically, what I'm getting at is, if they start to shred through your stacks of Dark Trooper, you've already lost. Like, the game is already done by then. You might not even have, I forget what the exact, the mark that Piet gives Dark, that might even be gone. You might have other characters killed when he sits there with 4 stacks, and it just doesn't end up making a difference. I've never had a single fight where it made a difference. Not in PvP or PvE. It might have happened to someone at some point where it got, like, really dirty into it, and that kind of saved them, but never, not once. Not once has that ever happened to me. It just really doesn't change his character. So this one, I'm not sure if I would just globally tell everyone never do this one, but this one was a mistake for me because I did this fairly late. I did not do this when Bastila first came out. When Bastila first came out, I was actually still messing around with Qui-Gon Jinn way before he had his Omicron. But my biggest issue here is we have too many other relevant Jedi leaders out there that even in 3v3, I just never use this. Between Qui-Gon, JML, Jedi Knight Luke, Jedi Knight Revan, they all are like your main Jedi squads, but then your Jedi get split up into other things too. Like one ends up going with Starkiller, one ends up going with Mon Mothma, maybe two go with JMK. Gas is probably going to stay in his squad. Some are probably going to split off and go with Padme because there's a lot of GR crossover. She just doesn't really have a space in. There was like one small period of time where her and Cam could do fun things, but the caliber of teams, at least in the higher end of GAC, has kind of risen above that, where the two of them can't really take anything out. So there might actually, depending on what you're doing, if JML and Jedi Knight Luke just aren't in your plans, you're going a different direction for your firing purposes or whatever, maybe it's a good idea. But it's one that I regret for my roster specifically. So maybe take Bastila Shan with a grain of salt, depending on what you're trying to build and how you're trying to build. The other thing I guess negative about it, I would say, is there are a lot of times where I really need Bastila to be in the Jedi Knight Rabbit team, because the amount of potency she adds through her unique can actually make a difference. Next up is going to be JTR. This one also might have been good once upon a time, but how Resistance has evolved, it really just has not been overall that great. And that is going to be her Insight Zeta. At the end of her turn, if Rey already had a critical damage up, she gains offense up until she is damaged. That's the problem. At the start of each encounter, Rey gains Foresight until she evades. When Rey evades, she recovers 5% health and protection. So the reason why I'm just not a super big fan of this one, and actually the Foresight might be a little bit useful if people are still using it with Holdo, but the majority of what's going on here is already like not super great. The reason why is because this was a way to make JTR a tank without actually making her taunt, in the sense that you were punished by the fact that she was getting all these other buffs if you were letting her keep taking turns. The issue with that now is she is actually tanking. If you put her in a raid team with the Resistance hero Finn, and he's constantly going and making her taunt, she actually now has the job of a functional tank. And with that being said, she's going to take damage, and she's going to end up losing these buffs, and it's really just not going to be that big of a deal. The Foresight, I guess, is okay. The recovery is okay, but it might have changed a few battles along the way, but I feel like when that was more so in an older meta, when I wasn't putting my droids with Sortie, or when I wasn't putting the rest of my Resistance with my Finn. So again, I guess this is another take with a grain of salt. Depending on what you're doing, it might be good, but as things currently sit, it really hasn't done much for me, and it hasn't done much for me at all throughout time, just because of how late I ended up putting it on. It actually might have been really important heroic Sith raid now that I think about it, but that's a little bit of a thing in the past. Next up is going to be 3PO, and this one, I knew this one wasn't that good when I applied it, and I still did it, and I think I just wanted to burn through Zetas, and if I'm entirely honest, oh yeah, it's this one. At the start of the encounter, 3PO and R2 gain translation for 3 turns. So basically, this allows 3PO and R2 to start with translation out the bat. It's okay. I can't really think of a specific counter that this enhances. I never run them with R2 for that matter. I guess maybe some people do. But what actually bugs me a little bit about this, in 3v3, one of the most common counters to CLS is Bad Batch. And when you start the team with a bunch of buffs, Echo gets to rip off extra stuff. And when he rips off extra stuff, they get more turn meter, and then you can close the gap with tech. And it's not just that it's not super influential or doesn't change a lot, but it actually can backfire on you. It can actually be beneficial for the enemy team. We're going to see that a little bit with him and our next Captain Stark. So again, maybe it's good in some situations. I have not found a counter that particularly relies on it. And there are some situations where on defense where I'm just like, oh yeah, that's the opposite of what I wanted to happen. And last is going to be Captain Stark with Captain Timeout. So we've previously talked about troopers actually a lot. There's 3 troopers on this list. And one of the big things is they like turn meter, they like to get ahead of the opponent, and like to destroy them. However, over the last couple of years, we've had a few units out there that are anti-turn meter, in the sense that if you just keep taking turns, you will never actually kill them. One of the 2 really greatest examples of this are Nest, as well as Jango under a Separatist lead. Jango will stay in damage immunity for the first 2 turns, and if you never let him take a turn, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And in addition to that, Nest, you need big hits, and you need her to take turns in between them to be able to work her health down. And one of the issues with Stark is he's not just going to give your team turn meter, which he will do through his specials if you so choose to use them. That can actually be a good thing in a lot of scenarios. But if we look on his unique Zeta here, at the end of his turn, Stark recovers 3% protection. That's actually pretty cool. And removes 1% turn meter from all enemies for each active Empire ally, doubled for Imperial Trooper allies. So he's going to be removing, I think this is, each active Empire ally. So that'll be 10% turn meter. So every single time he takes a turn. That's how you get a turn meter train to the point where Jango never comes at a damage immunity, and you time out on the team that you otherwise should have just completely walked over. There are ways kind of around it, at least with Jango. You can kind of hit him and let's say Newt's lead, let him get out his extortion, and that will give their team speed. But then you have to go through that whole nuance where you could just like not apply the Zeta and apply it to something else that you needed, like Riva before 5v5 lock, and then you wouldn't have that problem. Not speaking at all from experience. So that is going to be our list. Let me know like if there are like specific niche situations out there where some of these can be really cool, or if we missed one. Well, and to be fair, actually, there probably are a lot more Zetas out there that we didn't talk about, but I specifically wanted to talk about the ones that I myself apply, just so we didn't really throw anyone under the bus. But anyways, thank you guys for watching, and as always, stay awesome.